since 2014, which is a long, long time ago now, considering that we've had 2 years of COVID and everything else. So let me share my screen and get the slides up. And just do one more thing, sorry. All right, so as Lynda said, today's presentation is titled Bushkinders, a Place to Commence Children's STEM Learning. This has become my PhD, but the research began as a corridor conversation between Coral and myself back in 2014. I was very fortunate to I have 3 children, and my youngest daughter, Sarah, who's just started high school now, back in 2014 was part of a Bushkinder pilot on the Surf Coast. And Coral and I were talking one day in the corridor, and Coral was having some problems getting an entree into Bushkinders, and it was just fortuitous at that moment that I said, well, I know the Bushkinder teachers, big note in yourself, of course, and let's get this research happening. So a corridor conversation 8 years down the track has turned into what is a really rich and wonderful research project. Let me also acknowledge country, and I use an acknowledgement of country that's been provided by the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Strategy and Innovation at Deakin University, a gentleman by the name of Professor Mark Rose. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let's take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we conduct this meeting today. We acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of all the land we work on and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. So I thought I might start today with a vignette, and in our abstract for today's presentation, we mentioned that there would be a few vignettes as we go along. So I'm somewhat of a storyteller, because I think the stories of what we've seen out in the field are what really bring the richness to the project and the work that we've been doing. So it was a late autumn morning, not sort of unlike today, that was overcast, and I arrived at Sunrise Bushkinder at about 8:45 in the morning, and about a quarter of an hour before the session was commencing. There was 3 early childhood educators there. They were preparing for the session by setting up a portable table and some mats on the ground and tarpaulins for children to sit on, and a small shelter. Several of the children had already arrived and had commenced their play. The regular routine for the children was to arrive, to be greeted by the teacher and farewelled by their parent or carer, and to immediately go off into the Bushkinder and commence play. The children would spend all their time in the Bushkinder playing during a 4-hour session, and the teachers and educators would roam around the site, teaching and scaffolding at a point of need. On this day, I noticed that there was a large limb of a gum tree that had fallen on the ground. Miriam, one of the educators, said to me that yes, that had fallen several weeks prior, and that the Shire Council had come in and trimmed the tree, trimmed the sort of the broken ends off it, and left it there for the children to play. And this limb had become quite a gathering point for the children, and it suited quite a number of purposes. There were lots of opportunities for STEM play, according to Miriam, who viewed STEM play as the focus of the Bushkinder. And again, according to Miriam, this was where the children could take the science, the technology, the engineering and the mathematics and play. So at times I'd watch the children balance and walk along the log. It was a balance beam at times. And Miriam actually commented to me that she'd spent some time during the conventional kindergarten, back in the kindergarten premises, talking to the children about safe play and how best to balance on play equipment. So on this day, several boys had focused their play on this limb, gesticulating to the other children to come and join the play. Come and see what we're doing. One actually yelled to me. So Miriam was standing next to me and we were chatting, and we went over to the boys, and Miriam asked the boys, well, what are you doing? And one of the boys replied, we're about to leave for the moon. This is our spaceship. So Miriam started up a conversation and inquired as to the suitability of the log for going into space. And this discussion continued for about 3 minutes regarding what these young astronauts would require to depart the Earth and what the children had hoped to find in space and on the moon. The young astronauts had actually found a house brick, which you can see in the picture there, and that had been repurposed to become the control panel for this rocket ship, this spaceship. And next to that, the child that you can see on the left had a small sort of paving stone that similarly had become a control panel and a screen to see what was going on in space. So the children looked to the heavens, and one boy mentioned to Miriam that the sky's clear. It's a great day to take off, to which Miriam asked, well, what is it about today's weather that makes this a good day? And the discussion continued. Well, there's not much wind, there's a little cloud cover, and the sun is shining. Now, at this moment, another child who was sitting further down the log went and grabbed a small stick, and this stick had become repurposed to be the joystick to control the spaceship. So the children were well balanced and they remained seated on their imaginary spaceship and were ready for liftoff. Another boy replied, yes, we're ready to take off. So it was decided that there needed to be a countdown. The teacher asked where they would start, to which one of the astronauts shouted, let's start at 10. It was agreed upon and the countdown began. 10, 9, 8, 2, 1, liftoff. The boys' excitement was actually really audible. It was amazing as they spoke about what they would see and what they would experience while they were in space. All the while, Miriam kept asking about the journey. How was the spacecraft flying? What sensations were the boys experiencing? What were they feeling? Did they actually know what gravity was? What could they see in space? So this spaceship journey continued on for about 15 minutes, after which time the astronauts safely had returned to Earth and landed, and they departed the vessels having experienced the wonders of space. So my point with this opening vignette, as you can see, as part of this imaginary journey into space, here were the STEM domains being integrated into play: force, number, space. Some technology was being applied. So with that story in mind, what I'm going to talk today about is a little bit about our research and what we've done over those 7, nearly 8 years since that corridor conversation commenced. I'll talk a little bit about the methodological considerations that have come into play over those 8 years, as what was initially for me a paid role as a research assistant has developed into a PhD project. And then I'll come to Bush Kinder STEM pedagogy. So a little bit about Bush Kinders to start with. There's been global growth in forest schools and nature kindergartens to provide children with greater opportunities to access the outdoors and to build perceptions of the world around them. These nature-based education contexts really provide opportunities for early years learners to develop STEM understandings through often what is their own child-initiated learning through play. And more often than not, this play is only with what nature provides. For over 50 years, the forest school approach to nature learning has gathered a lot of momentum in the UK and across parts of Europe, including Scandinavia. And these sites of nature-based learning take on very different forms, which can be dependent upon their location, in addition to how the controlling bodies adapt curriculum and risk management to these particular sites. And forest schools around the world are being adapted to local circumstances. So in Australia, there's a growing number of nature or bush kinders, which colloquially are called bush kinder, that have been adapted to suit the local weather, the local flora and the local fauna. So while STEM learning in the early years has been the focus of a number of studies, our niche in our research project is STEM learning in bush kinders, because there's still lots we can investigate. Influenced by that forest school approach to early years nature-based education, bush kinder programs often occur in urban, peri-urban and regional settings. And they can range from open paddocks, wooded parklands and public reserves, and luckily for us down on the surf coast where Coral and I are, there are beach kinders. And they take place in almost all weather conditions, except for when there are really extreme weather conditions where lightning and storms or excessive heat. So differing from the European iterations of outdoor nature-based education, bush kinders in Australia are still growing. They're very much in an emergent stage and developing. They don't have the same curriculum and regulatory conditions and constraints that, say, for example, they do have in the UK. And they are very much grounded in what I would see as the cultural traditions of outdoor learning in Australia. Bush kinders provide physical outdoor learning spaces as well as affordances and opportunities that are available for teaching and learning. The previous research that has been undertaken into bush kinders really highlights that there are a range of pedagogical approaches that guide teachers' practice in this growing field of nature pedagogy or nature-based learning. Teachers, we've seen, have often adapted and adopted a pedagogical approach that's reliant on a child's discovery in nature to create the teaching opportunities that come with a bush kinder session. As I said, bush kinders are very much an approach to nature education with Australian conditions in mind. We see them as a place for STEM learning, and the teachers and educators that we've interacted with agree with this on a lot of occasions, in that, yes, these are great places for children to learn about STEM because of the abundance of flora and fauna and the natural materials that can support educators to extend their pedagogy across STEM disciplines. Interestingly, bush kinders generally involve the removal of artificial and synthetic implements that are often found in a conventional kindergarten situation. So balls and play equipment and Tonka trucks and tablets aren't taken out into the bush kinder. What you can see in the slide there is what is there for play. It's almost totally reliant on what nature provides for children to play. So while in the bush kinder, young children have often been found to have this capacity to notice and play with what nature provides and build the skill of noticing. And it's important when we think about the STEM skills that children build on, how that noticing of what's in nature can develop over the duration of a bush kinder year, to the extent that the noticing that goes on by children is shown to demonstrate growth in their understanding of STEM in nature. And through that, educators and teachers will build confidence in applying STEM pedagogically to their bush kinder teaching. Yet, as I said, often that pedagogy is influenced by what the educator's prior teaching experience is and how they approach their teaching in the traditional kindergarten setting. It's the accessibility of the nature spaces that provide the opportunity for play through which children can really reconnect and get back to nature in these urban, peri-urban and regional settings. But play is crucial to the child's development, and particularly in the bush kinder, because what we've seen in our research is this often self-directed, imaginative, challenging and meaningful play that goes on is beneficial for the children's learning and how they interact in bush kinders and to build their STEM understandings. Okay. So when we commenced our research, we believed that a case study approach would be the methodology. We went out with a specific focus into the bush kinders, and that changed over time. We had 3 bush kinders in mind to visit on 4 occasions when Coral and I first decided to undertake this research. We had a defined rationale for what we were doing, and we wanted to look at the science learning that was taking place. And I'll take you through the papers that we've written out of this later on to give you a sense of the researcher journey. But accordingly, those first 2 papers took that theme. And as someone who, as an undergraduate, who in their undergraduate studies came to this project with a background in anthropology and history, what became apparent as we progressed this study was the benefits of undertaking a methodological approach of ethnography. One of the things that became apparent to me as I was looking at the literature for methodology is a work by Marie Parker Jenkins, who's a professor of education at the University of Limerick. And she problematised this notion of the difference between ethnography and case study and reflecting on using ethnographic techniques in how a researcher positions themselves. And the quote that I've got at the top of this slide is that her contention is that in many cases, researchers are not actually conducting ethnography as understood within a traditional sense, but rather are engaging in case study, drawing on ethnographic techniques. Does that matter, you might ask? Well, it determines on what we can expect to discover from a research project in terms of its results and unearthing of the real complexities that go on in a research project. So why do I talk about that? Well, if I look towards the data collection that we did, we've done a number of interviews and spent a lot of time in bush kinders. The initial 4 visits each to the bush kinder sites ended up being around about 100, of where we would sit and observe and participate in the sessions and listen to what was happening around us and document our observations and what we participated in through journals and photographs and images through audio and video. We'd also go back occasionally to the bush kinder sites themselves to look at the sites when the sessions weren't occurring, to see what was happening in the space. And occasionally also went to the conventional kinder to see the intersections between what was taking place with the STEM learning in the bush kinders and what was happening back at the conventional kindergarten. We immersed ourselves, I believe, in the data and the context. And that really allowed us to see this study as ethnographic. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about our research and what we did. As I said, a corridor conversation in 2014 ended up a year later with Coral and myself beginning to research science, teaching and pedagogy in bush kinders at a number of sites with 12 educators and 125 children. But we kept going back. We kept being invited back, and the children were so enthusiastic to see us come back. In 2016, we started analysing our data, and the science learning was much more than that, because we could see the STEM that was coming through, the mathematics, the technology and the engineering that was taking place through the children's play. We undertook and participated in a national survey. And then in 2017, we went back to the bush kinders and again immersed ourselves in the sessions regularly, looking for not only the science this time, but what else was happening. And we picked up that creativity was one of the themes, one of the things that we wanted to investigate through our research. But we also noticed, and through the conversations that we were having with the educators, a difference in how the boys and girls were interacting. And it led us to undertaking this sort of secondary analysis of the data that we'd already collected and identified a new line of inquiry to collect new data. So further reviews of the data, keeping in contact with the teachers regularly, and we identified in 2019 that potentially there was the opportunity to look at gender and group dynamics in bush kinders, and pedagogy again became the focus. And then in 2020, I was fortunate enough to commence my PhD and went back and collect further data to look and see what the changes had been, to revisit those key themes that we looked at in 2015 and 2017 and see what the changes had been in bush kinders over time and what the teachers and the educators had learned. So our research has been evolving over time from a very singular focus. And as Coral said to me yesterday, it's almost like it's a tree that's got branches on it, how we can look at the different themes and approaches that are out there. So very quickly about STEM pedagogy. In the early years, it's often play-based. It's often child-instigated, but it also supports the teacher's planning. And what we've seen in the bush kinder, as I mentioned earlier, is that there is this range of pedagogical approaches that take place, which is often determined by, well, what's my preferred approach pedagogically back in the conventional kindergarten? Is it where I'm directing? Is it where I'm guiding as an educator? Or is it child-led? And let me tell you a little bit about some of the things that we saw that informed our thinking when it comes to STEM pedagogy in bush kinders. And I'm going to use some vignettes which have already been reported in one of the papers that was published in 2020. So if you've read that paper, you're going to know what's coming. But ultimately, there are 3 vignettes that speak to the different pedagogical approaches that occur at bush kinder. And the first one I call a teacher's chair in the bush, because at one of the bush kinders, which we call chat log, the children would arrive at the bush kinder and this teacher had prepared a program. So the children arrive, they come and sit on their mats at the start of the session, and there would be 2 chairs at the front or in front of the mats where the teachers would sit, the educators would sit. The children would arrive, they'd put their belongings aside on a mat and would gather there. Another educator would sit in sort of a circle where the children were arranged and would talk to the children. And these 20 or so children would then face Amanda, the lead educator, and her role as the lead educator was almost delineated by sitting at the front of this bush kinder session. And Amanda would start by outlining the day's activities. And on this particular day, there was a focus on fungi. So Amanda discussed it and showed some books and asked the children questions about what they knew about fungi. And then the children as a group got up and started to go on a nature walk around the outskirts of the bush kinder. And they progressed around this dirt track and would stop at intervals and look for fungi. And the discussion would continue. And the children would observe the surroundings, and Amanda would point to the fungi. And eventually the bush walk came back to its beginnings on the mat, and the children sat down and there was a conversation about what the children had said. But this was very much a pedagogical approach that was directed by Amanda, the lead educator, and took on this guise or similarity to what she would do back in the conventional regular kindergarten 3 days a week. At the other end of the spectrum for this is that same log the boys were sitting on, which one day became an ice cream shop. And a group of girls were playing nearby and around the log and roaming around, and they had repurposed sticks of wood and pieces of bark as money and had pretend ice creams in cones, and were handing these out as people would come and buy the ice creams. And Emma, one of the teachers, was there and was standing and talking to the children about money and counting and how what nature had provided them to play and repurpose as money, well, what that meant to the children. But this was very much a session that was child-led, or play that was child-led. And the educator in this instance came and scaffolded the learning. And then in the middle of that is teacher guided. And Sarah, who's a teacher at another bush kinder, which we call Wicklesham, had made plans for the day around what the children would do. There was some, but quite limited structure to what would take place in the bush kinder. The children had been investigating clouds in recent sessions. So Sarah was hoping to talk to the children about the clouds and the weather that they saw outside at the bush kinder. So as the children arrived, sporadically, she would ask the children individually, well, what do you think, what's happening with the weather today? And the children sang songs about the weather and talked about the weather and what was happening in each other's lives. And then out they went to the bush kinder. And again, it was a day that was quite damp due to the rainfall that had happened. So the children put on their wet weather gear, and the educator helped with this, and then out they went through the gate, out to a large vacant block of land with a range of trees that were small and tall, and some uncut grass. The children took their backpacks out with them and placed them on the ground, and Sarah pointed to the sky to talk about the weather. But at this point, some children had found a small insect, and they'd sort of poked at it with sticks and had used to dig it around about the foot of the tree. And this was something that was interest to them. So they'd come across these small creatures, and they called Sarah, the educator, over to show her their discovery. And as these small insects wouldn't stay still, Sarah suggested that they could collect them for a short time and observe them in the magnifying containers available that they had in the trolley that they brought out with them. So they did this for some time, looking closely, counting the legs on the insects and observing the antenna and the body shape of the insects. And then after some time, Sarah reminded them that they'd disturbed this animal and that they had to return it back to its own home. So apart from connecting with their activities as they'd call to her and wandering around and asking questions, Sarah had drawn the children's attention to the science in the environment through her own explorations. She'd excitedly point to a bird overhead and talk to the weather that was going on. So all the time bringing the discussion back to the weather, which was her focus, but guiding the children. And Sarah behaved in somewhat of a playful manner, highlighting the new things that the children may not have observed. So where am I going with these three vignettes? Well, the outcome of what we'd seen, we've put into this model, this almost continuum of what's taken place. And we've drawn on the work of Susan Edwards, who developed a pedagogical play framework for early childhood, which you can see in the rectangular boxes up the top. Erin Furtak and others, who has come up with, or had come up in 2012, with this model of teacher-led, teacher-guided and student-led discovery for more primary and secondary years, and then taken what we'd witnessed in the vignettes that we've got to say, well, yes, teacher-led, teacher-guided and student-led is absolutely applicable in what we've seen pedagogically from the educators who are there in the bush kinder. So when we look at STEM in bush kinders, what is the experiential context that offers teachers the opportunity to develop STEM teaching and learning approaches that foster children's STEM learning? And we saw that in a scorpion hunt that took place in one of the bush kinders that we went to. And hand on heart, even though I lived quite close to this bush kinder, I never knew that we had scorpions down where we live. So again, it was one of those cold mornings and the overnight rain had made the ground wet, and I unfortunately arrived late on this day to the bush kinder, and the children were playing and were really excited. And they were digging a hole with some sticks that they'd found in the ground and really were sort of making a small hole. And Lynda, who was one of the educators, beckoned me over and said, oh, we found some scorpions in the ground last week and the children are actually digging them. They're very excited about it. So Lynda and the children beckoned me over, and here they were digging, being aware that, Lynda, that is, being aware that through some of her own research, that how to effectively treat animal habitats and how to use limited force in digging, so not to create damage. And although there's a shovel in this picture, which could potentially damage the habitat, the digging that had been done had primarily been done very carefully with pieces of bark and pieces of stick, and had taken quite some time. So Lynda, as the children were gathered around this hole as it grew, began to talk to the children, ask them questions about what they'd learnt. What did they notice about the hole in the scorpion's home? What was it about the ground that made this suitable for the scorpion? Was it the wet or the dry earth? How had they used the sticks to dig, and what force had they applied in digging the hole? And Lynda, conscious to protect the scorpion and its nest, then came back with the shovel so as to very carefully just do a little bit more excavating and then to put the hole back. So Lynda and I sort of then after that recommenced our walk around the bush kinder, and Lynda actually showed me on her phone an app that she'd been using to support the scaffolding of the learning that the children had taken place. And she actually then said to me how the science and the technology had come together to allow the children to think about the implements in nature that can be repurposed for digging. I'm sort of getting close to time, so I'll very briefly just, again, another example of STEM in bush kinders is this one that we've seen, in which you can see in this picture an educator and a child looking at an ant procession. And there was counting that took place as a long row of ants moved through the grass and the patterns that they formed. And the discussions that took place as to why these ants would be on the move and how these ants were carrying small pieces of leaves as they moved through the grass. So again, we can see, again, in this very much the bridge version of this vignette, this idea of how science and mathematics and technology can come together. And in other examples that we've seen where children have built small dwellings like cubby houses out of sticks and leaves, the engineering that can take place in the bush kinder, that's also there. So a model that's currently in one of the papers that is being under review is this one here, where we look at the work of Anne Forbes and others who have recently written a text called STEM in Primary Schools, where they have developed a model that looks at how the processes of STEM teaching and learning take place, particularly at a primary school level, where ask, imagine, plan, create, and improve are this process that allows for STEM teaching and learning to take place, where the teacher defines and understands a task, where the teacher investigates, designs and plans for teaching and learning, comes up with teaching and learning solutions, and then applies those solutions to support the teaching and the learning. Janice Wiedel-Lubinski in 2019 also came up with a model which we've overlaid with Forbes's to think about how children's outdoor learning takes place through observation, through wonderment and asking questions, through tinkering and investigating and experimenting, through modifying the predictions that come through the asking of the questions, and then to share outcomes. So where does that fit into what Cole and I have done? Well, ultimately, we're looking at this idea of a process and a model to speak to bush kinder STEM teaching and learning. This cyclical model that draws on the work of Forbes and STEM education in primary schools and Wiedel-Lubinski's outdoor education to sort of put the two together and think about STEM teaching and learning in bush kinders, where we can identify and understand the STEM that takes place in nature as educators, and then examine and do some research as educators of what's available to understand and to build STEM knowledge in what's available in nature, and to plan and design, to create and to assess and evaluate the learning, and then to build on that by, again, identifying the what's next. So by adopting this sort of 5-step model, we're commencing with this challenge or issue that's out there to learn about and potentially connect any curriculum followed by assessment. So the model provides these phases which allow for examples of teaching to be really interrogated and to be analysed, so that while teaching at these nature-based education settings is often spontaneous and at times unplanned, projects can occur that the children can instigate and work with through their play. Okay. So, excuse me for a moment. All right. So being conscious of time, some of the key things that we've taken away from the work we've been doing is that taking an approach to STEM teaching and learning that's aimed at an indoor classroom, in an indoor classroom setting, and applying it to the bush kinder context demonstrates that STEM teaching and learning is as appropriate indoors as it is in nature. And there's the opportunities are almost abundant in a bush kinder. Elsewhere in other papers, as a result of this research, we've documented that children's STEM noticing and confidence when being in a bush kinder develops over time, and also that girls' STEM identity really grows as a result of their time spent in bush kinder interactions. Yes, there's the potential for this to be further explored and for the direct and indirect outcomes of young children of STEM teaching and learning to be examined still. But really, what's apparent to me as a PhD student is that there's growth and diverse research that can come from immediate or going out with this one focus that can then branch out in a number of areas. And there is still this amazing opportunity and potential for other discipline-based learning, domains such as art and literacy and humanities that can be explored in future. So when I speak of how the growth and the diversity of this research has occurred over time, and without wanting to make this a blatant self-promotion of what we've published, you can see that our journey over the last 7 years has moved through the publications to being initially about place and understanding what the science is, to then building on that through examining the pedagogy, talking about the methodology, speaking about the children's noticing, the girl's STEM identity, the elements of sustainability that might be apparent. And the papers that are still, fingers crossed, to get over the line, are looking more holistically at STEM teaching and learning, and technology and engineering and mathematics learning. So for your reference, these are probably the 5 key sources that I've drawn on in today's presentation. Susan Edwards, who certainly informed our work when it came to thinking about the different pedagogical approaches that we were seeing in bush kinders, and Forbes's work, which has allowed us to conceptualise STEM teaching and learning. Similarly, Wiedel-Lubinski. Marie Parker-Jenkins, when it came to my thinking about the applicability of ethnography versus case study, is a really good paper because she really interrogates the difference between, well, what is ethnography and what is case study. And to me, it is so much about that immersion and that time spent in a research setting and building cultural understandings. And Erin Furtak's work, which again was also very helpful along with Susan Edwards' work, to thinking about what the pedagogical approaches were that were taking place in bush kinder and how we could interpret those. So I've cut a vignette out to make sure that I keep to the 40 minutes, but that really is our presentation. And I would love to get some feedback and thoughts from people on our work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris.